Beloved, your soulmate is crying with happiness right now, and it is not because you sent them a romantic message, and it is not because you suddenly asked them to return, and it is not because someone told them you are sitting somewhere waiting for them, because something completely different happened as your soulmate just heard about a decision you made. A decision they never imagined you would have the courage to make after everything you have been through. And when they heard the exact words you used, they became emotional. Because, beloved, you finally stopped choosing what appeared safe and started choosing what was actually true for you. As you finally said no to something you had been preparing yourself to accept, something everyone around you may have believed was good, logical, secure, perhaps even perfect. But your heart knew something was not right, and for once, instead of convincing yourself to tolerate it, you listened, and your soulmate heard, and they cried. Beloved, let me explain why this affected them so deeply. Because for such a long time, your soulmate has carried a particular fear about you. Not the fear that you would forget them, but something much deeper. They were afraid that the pain of loving them would eventually teach you to settle. Perhaps because of the uncertainty they once gave you, making you begin to believe that stable but empty was better than passionate but unclear. Maybe you even told yourself that you do not need some extraordinary love anymore, that you simply need someone who stays, someone acceptable, someone who does not complicate your life. And beloved, there is absolutely nothing wrong with wanting stability because you deserve it. But stability without emotional truth can become another form of loneliness. And your soulmate knew that because they had experienced it too, as they watched from a distance while your standards changed. Noticing how, at first, maybe you wanted love, real love, a connection where both people were emotionally honest. And then after disappointment, perhaps you began saying that you only want peace. But beloved, sometimes when a wounded person says peace, what they actually mean is that they never want to feel that much again. Your soulmate feared that their behavior had taught you exactly that, fearing they had turned your open heart into something guarded, that they had made you associate deep love with uncertainty, and perhaps your soulmate carried guilt because of it. Thinking about what might happen the next time somebody truly loves you if you do not trust it because of them, wondering what if you choose somebody you do not genuinely love because safe feels easier, and asking what if they damaged the part of you that believed love could be both deep and peaceful. That thought troubled your soulmate more than you ever realized. And then recently they heard you had an opportunity to choose a different future, perhaps with somebody around you who was liked by others, dependable, established, respectful, maybe even approved by your family, with friends saying they are good for you, that they can give you security, and that you should seriously consider this. Maybe this person was not bad, which matters because there was no villain. Perhaps they genuinely cared about you, meaning that from the outside, choosing them made perfect sense. And beloved, for a while, maybe you considered it not because you were deeply in love, but because part of you thought that perhaps this is what adulthood is. Maybe passionate love is overrated, maybe you should choose what is safe, and maybe feeling deeply is what got you hurt before. This led your soulmate to hear pieces of this through someone close to the situation, making them devastated at first, though they said nothing because what right did they have? They were once part of the reason you became cautious. They could not suddenly appear and say, "Do not choose that person," because your life was yours. Your soulmate had to accept the possibility and tell themselves that if you were happy, that is what mattered. Someone even asked whether they would be okay with it, to which your soulmate simply looked away because that was not really the point, since, of course, they were not okay. The thought of you building a life with somebody else hurt deeply. But beneath the jealousy was another fear. Not simply that someone else would have you, but that you might choose them because they made you stop believing you deserved a love you actually felt. That created a guilt your soulmate could barely carry, making your soulmate want to contact you and say, "Please do not settle because of what happened with me before." But they stopped because they imagined how manipulative that could sound, knowing they could not read your heart. Realizing that perhaps you genuinely loved this person, and if that was true, your soulmate had to respect it. So they remained silent until yesterday, when something happened. There was a conversation where maybe someone asked you directly why you have not said yes yet. And beloved, perhaps you had been delaying and people had noticed because the person was good and the future looked stable, leaving everyone to wonder what the problem was, causing you to try to explain that you do not know, leading someone to respond by asking what there is to know since they care about you, to which you said you know. And when they pointed out that the person is serious, you said you know. And when they added that this person can give you a good life, you again said you know, prompting them to ask why you were hesitating. And beloved, perhaps for the first time, you stopped trying to produce a reasonable explanation. Instead, you said the truth. You are hesitating because you do not want to say yes, simply because you are afraid you will never feel safe with somebody you actually love. That sentence traveled until it eventually reached your soulmate, who then broke down because they understood exactly what you were saying, realizing you were no longer choosing from fear, not fear of being alone, not fear of wasting time, and not fear that strong love always becomes painful. Rather, you were choosing from self-respect, saying that a person can be good and still not be your person, that a future can look perfect and still not feel like yours, that security matters but you are not going to trade your emotional truth just to make everybody comfortable. Beloved, your soulmate cried because this was the version of you they feared they had destroyed, the version that still trusted your own heart, the version that did not confuse settling with healing, the version that could say you want peace. Yes, but you also want love, consistency, and desire. Wanting someone whose presence feels safe, not merely someone whose resume looks safe. And your soulmate heard what you did when the mutual person told them you said no, causing your soulmate to immediately ask, to what? And upon learning it was to the future everyone thought you were going to accept, your soulmate became completely still. And when the person asked why and mentioned that you said, you cannot build a life from fear, your soulmate's eyes filled immediately. Maybe they turned away and tried to hide it until the person noticed they were crying, leading your soulmate to laugh through their tears, saying, no, obviously yes. Now please subscribe our channel for more videos and click the bell icon. And when the person asked why this made you happy, beloved, your soulmate gave an answer that was completely unexpected. They said, it is because they thought they had taught you to stop trusting love, and after a long pause, they realized they apparently had not. And that realization carried far more meaning than anyone around them initially understood. Because this is not simply happiness because you became available again, as that would be selfish and far too simple. Your soulmate is emotional because you chose yourself in a way that proved your pain did not permanently diminish you. You went through disappointment, confusion, silence, and emotional difficulty, but somehow you learned from it without allowing it to turn you into someone who no longer believes in love. You became wiser without becoming cynical. You became stronger without becoming completely closed off. You became more careful without becoming numb. You developed discernment rather than building walls around your heart. And that difference is what touched your soulmate so deeply. They had perhaps carried a quiet fear that if you ever healed from everything that happened between you, your healing would mean shutting down emotionally, becoming distant, and deciding that love was no longer worth the risk. They may have imagined that one day you would simply stop caring, but what they are seeing now is completely different. Your healing has begun to look like standards. It has begun to look like self-respect. It has begun to look like the ability to say no to something that once would have been difficult to refuse. And that realization overwhelmed them enough that the person eventually asked your soulmate whether they were going to contact you now. Surprisingly, your soulmate immediately said no. This answer created another pause because the obvious question became, why not? Why would someone who still feels so much, someone who is clearly affected by your decision, choose not to reach out immediately? Your soulmate explained that your decision was not made for them. It would be wrong to turn your act of self-trust into a signal that now they could simply return and have access to you again. They understand that your choice was about your own life, your own peace, and your own truth. You did not say no to one future so that your soulmate could immediately rush in and claim the empty space. You did not make a difficult decision simply to create an opening for them, and your soulmate understands. understands that, or at least they are beginning to understand it on a deeper level. They need to know that you did this for yourself. That matters tremendously because if they rush toward you immediately, you might begin questioning your own motives. You might wonder whether you only made the decision because some hidden part of you was hoping they would come back. You could begin doubting your own clarity and asking yourself whether you had truly chosen yourself or whether you had simply chosen another path toward them. And your soulmate does not want to contaminate the clarity you finally discovered. That is why they are holding themselves back, even though emotionally they may be struggling to contain everything they feel. Instead, they are sitting with the emotion. They may be crying while also smiling. They may be replaying old conversations in their mind, remembering small details they once dismissed, but now suddenly understand differently. Perhaps they remember something you told them years ago, something that seemed simple at the time, but now carries an entirely different meaning. Maybe during your connection, you once told them that you did not want perfect. You wanted real. You wanted honesty rather than promises that sounded beautiful but could not survive reality. Your soulmate remembers those words, even though they may not have understood how serious you were when you said them. At that time, perhaps they thought you were being romantic, idealistic, or even unrealistic. They may have believed that eventually you would realize life does not work that way and that practical decisions require certainty. But now, years later, your actions are proving that those words were never simply about them. They were a value you carried inside yourself. You were saying that you would rather face uncertainty honestly than enter certainty dishonestly. You would rather admit that you did not know what the future held than pretend that everything was fine simply because a particular path appeared safe. And that realization has earned an entirely new level of respect from your soulmate. Yet there is another layer to this, beloved. And this may be the part that has affected them most deeply. Your decision forced your soulmate to confront their own life. They suddenly realized that if you were finally able to stop choosing from fear, then what excuse did they have left? They could no longer comfortably tell themselves that fear was simply practicality. They could no longer automatically hide behind circumstances and call that wisdom. Your soulmate has also been living inside compromises. They have been telling themselves that family expects certain things. Their career requires certain sacrifices. Too much time has already passed. You probably moved on. Maybe it would be safer not to disturb anything. Maybe remaining where they are is more responsible. Maybe wanting something different is selfish. Maybe the risks are too great. These thoughts can sound reasonable when repeated often enough, and your soulmate may have spent a long time turning fear into something that looked like common sense. But then they heard what you did. They learned that you had a safe option in front of you and still said no. Not because you had a guaranteed better option waiting somewhere else. Not because you knew exactly what would happen afterward. Not because someone had promised you that everything would work out. You said no while uncertainty was still present. And that detail matters enormously. You chose uncertainty over self-betrayal. That decision frightened your soulmate and inspired them at the same time because perhaps they realized you were doing something they had never been able to do. You were choosing truth without a guaranteed reward. You were choosing what felt honest even though there was no contract with the future promising that your decision would eventually make everything easier. Your soulmate once wanted certainty before choosing you. They wanted to know whether everything would work, whether you would remain, whether family would approve, whether circumstances would become easier, whether there would be enough time, whether the future could be controlled. They wanted answers before courage, but you just demonstrated something completely different. You essentially said, "I do not know exactly what comes after this, no, but I know that saying yes to something that feels wrong would be dishonest." And that realization caused something inside your soulmate to break open emotionally. Suddenly, they understood what courage actually looks like. Courage is not always feeling certain. Courage is not knowing everything will work out. Courage is choosing honestly while uncertainty is still sitting beside you. And perhaps in that moment, your soulmate whispered something to themselves that they had never been willing to admit before. "You are braver than I ever was." The mutual person then asked what they meant, and your soulmate explained that you had said no without knowing what would come next. That statement forced them to sit quietly with their own memories. They began remembering all the moments when they had said no to what they actually wanted simply because they did not know what would happen afterward. For years, they may have told themselves that the two of you lost each other because circumstances were impossible, and perhaps some circumstances genuinely were difficult. There may have been real obstacles, real responsibilities, real fears, and real complications. But now your soulmate is beginning to see something uncomfortable. Some of that impossibility came from demanding guarantees that life was never going to provide. You did not receive a guarantee when you made your decision either. You simply refused to abandon yourself, and that distinction has made your soulmate question everything. They may now be wondering what their own life would look like if they made a similar decision. What would happen if they stopped choosing based entirely on fear? Should they consider making a move? Should they finally have a conversation they have been avoiding? Should they establish a boundary with family? Should they end a situation that looks correct from the outside but feels wrong internally? Should they finally tell you the truth they have carried for so long? These questions may not have immediate answers, but they have entered their mind now, and they are difficult to silence. Beloved, before today, your soulmate kept saying, "Not yet." Not yet was the phrase that protected them. Not yet gave them another week, another month, another year to avoid making a difficult decision. Not yet allowed them to believe that eventually circumstances would become perfect enough to justify courage. But your choice shook that entire structure. They may have opened your old conversation. They may have scrolled through messages you exchanged long ago. They may have stopped on something you wrote years earlier, perhaps a sentence they had completely forgotten. Maybe you once told them that sometimes you have to decide what you want even when you have no idea how the story will end. Those words may have seemed ordinary back then. Now they feel almost prophetic, because your soulmate is beginning to realize that you were asking them to do back then what you have finally done now. You chose honestly without knowing the ending. You took responsibility for your own life without demanding that the future first promise you a reward. And your soulmate failed to do that when the opportunity was there. You succeeded where they once hesitated. That is why their tears can feel both happy and painful at the same time. There is pride in those tears. There is regret. There is love. There is relief. There is also grief for a version of your story that might have existed if they had possessed the same courage at the right moment. Your soulmate may wonder whether the two of you would still be together if different decisions had been made. They may imagine different conversations, different choices, different endings to moments that once felt unavoidable. But they also understand that nobody can truly answer those questions now. The past cannot be rewritten simply because the present has become clearer. What they can understand is that the decisions should have been honest, and perhaps that is what gives your soulmate the deepest sense of respect for you now. Beloved, your soulmate is beginning to understand something else. Your decision proves that you were never asking them to be perfect. You were never demanding that they remove every fear before choosing you. You were never asking them to create a completely safe future before taking one honest step. You were simply asking them to choose from truth, nothing more. Perhaps your soulmate once believed you wanted too much. Maybe they thought you expected a guaranteed future, complete certainty, perfect timing, or a person who had no fear. But now they are looking at what you just did, and their understanding is changing. You willingly chose a future with less certainty because certainty without emotional truth was not enough for you. And that realization hurts because your soulmate suddenly understands that perhaps you would have done the same thing with them. Maybe you were always willing to navigate difficult circumstances together. Maybe you never expected them to solve every problem before choosing you. Maybe you were willing to walk through uncertainty as long as you knew they were walking beside you. That is the difference they are finally seeing. They thought they had to solve everything first. You were simply asking them to choose you first and then solve it together. Those are two completely different ways of approaching love. Now there is one line your soulmate apparently said after hearing about your decision. When the person told them that you had turned it down, your soulmate first asked whether you were okay. Then they asked whether you were upset. The person apparently answered that you were a little upset, but then they heard something unexpected. You said you felt lighter. And that sentence made your soulmate smile through tears, because perhaps that is how they finally knew. They understood that your decision was not about revenge. It was not about making anyone jealous. It was not about proving that you could survive without them. It was not about punishing the past. You made the choice because something inside you had finally become clear. You felt lighter. And when the person asked your soulmate what they thought about that, your soulmate replied that you had made the right decision for yourself. Those words are important, beloved, because your soulmate could have made the moment about themselves. They could have said that you should have chosen differently. They could have focused on what your decision meant for them. Instead, they recognize that your peace had to matter more than their desire. They are reflecting on that feeling of lightness now and understanding that maybe you are not instantly happier simply because the difficult choice has been made. Difficult choices can still hurt. Choosing yourself does not mean there will be no sadness afterward. It does not mean you will never question anything. It does not mean every memory suddenly disappears. Sometimes the right decision still produces tears. Sometimes freedom arrives with grief attached to it. Sometimes peace feels strange at first because you have become so accustomed to carrying uncertainty that putting it down feels almost unfamiliar. And your soulmate may finally understand that this is what your healing looks like. You did not become someone who stopped feeling. You became someone who stopped betraying what you feel simply to make life easier. You did not stop believing in love. You stopped accepting situations that required you to abandon yourself in order to keep love alive. You did not become cold. You became clear, and that clarity is what your soulmate is witnessing now. Perhaps they are realizing that the person they once knew is still there, but stronger, wiser, and more deeply rooted in self-respect. You are not running after them. You are not demanding an answer. You are not waiting for them to rescue you from your own decision. You have simply chosen your own truth. And somehow that has affected them more deeply than any message could have. Because now your soulmate has to face a question they have avoided for a very long time. If you could choose truth without knowing how the story ends, why can't they? If you could walk away from something safe because it was not emotionally honest, what are they still protecting themselves from? If you could survive the uncertainty, perhaps they can too. And that is why the emotion around your decision is so much deeper than simple happiness. Your soulmate is not merely happy that you are free. They are deeply moved because they are watching you prove that pain did not win. The disappointments did not destroy your ability to love. The silence did not erase your hope. The uncertainty did not make you surrender your standards. And the past did not convince you that you had to become someone you were never meant to be. You learned, you grew, you became stronger, but you remained capable of truth. And perhaps that is the greatest thing your soulmate has finally understood about you. You were never asking for a perfect love story. You were asking for an honest one, and now by choosing yourself, you have shown them exactly what that honesty looks like.